After the Committee of Public Safety had been purged at the end of July 1794, the French Revolution took a sharp turn to the right. By the spring of 1795, there were murmurs in and around Paris in favor of a restoration of the constitutional monarchy. Some figures in the convention hoped to prepare a moderate constitution with Louis XVI's surviving son, also named Louis, made king under a regency. The goal of that new constitutional monarchy would be to protect the advances made in making France a state governed by the rule of law, while protecting the property of those who had benefited most from the seizure and sale of church and noble lands in 1790. Any hope of restoring the monarchy on this basis collapsed in early June of 1795, when the young heir to the throne, always sickly, died in prison. This left his uncle, also named Louis, and known as the Count of Provence, as heir to the throne. Provence promptly declared himself King Louis XVIII when he heard of his nephew's death. It was a moment when a good king might have reached out to the men of the convention, seeking some kind of reconciliation. Instead, Louis XVIII issued his Declaration of Verona. In it, he declared that the only way forward was for the French to accept a return to the platform his brother, Louis XVI, had put forward on the 23rd of June, 1789. This meant a return to a regime in which nobles and clergymen had special privileges and would resume dominating political life. A system in which the Third Estate had much less power and political representation, and it also meant that the property seized from the church and from noble opponents of the revolution would have to be restored to its previous owners. Louis XVIII did declare an amnesty, though, for all revolutionaries should they accept his offer. All revolutionaries, that is, except those who had voted for the execution of his brother in 1793. This decision to exclude most of the convention from the amnesty meant that there was no hope for negotiation. Louis XVIII's insistence that France return to a slightly amended version of the old regime meant that Louis XVIII would have to take the throne back by force. As he had only a small army at his command, he had to hope for foreign assistance to link his men up with loyal supporters in France. All thoughts of a restoration by force in the near term were dashed with the failure of an invasion of the Brittany Peninsula at Quiberon on the south side of the peninsula in June and July of 1795. A discussion of the Quiberon invasion requires that we step back a moment and talk about the civil war in the Vendée and guerrilla war in Brittany, as well as say a bit more about the Jacobin obsession with the idea of a foreign plot that tied together all counter-revolutionaries in one vast conspiracy. The great French historian of the French Revolution, François Furet, had argued that there was no foreign plot or counter-revolutionary conspiracy that had to be crushed. He argued that the brutal repression of the year 1793-1794 had been caused by an internal struggle in the National Convention against phantom enemies. Historians now have mostly discarded this view. There were many real conspiracies, and royalists in France did get assistance from foreign powers. The invasion of Quiberon here was part of a foreign plot, one that linked the counter-revolution of the Vendée and Brittany with the war versus England, Spain, Austria, Prussia, and the Netherlands. The area known as the Vendée, in the west of France, had seen a massive uprising in 1793, where a so-called Catholic and Royal Army of the Vendée had come into being, led by clergy who opposed the revolution and royalist nobles. The uprising had led to a terrible, bloody civil war with atrocities performed by royalists and defenders of the Republic alike. A massive military effort had destroyed the royalist army after it failed to seize a port city and link up with the English to get supplies and reinforcements. In 1794, the war there had turned into an endless guerrilla campaign, and by the end of the year, one of the Republic's best generals, Lazare Hoche, had been dispatched there to end the rebellion in the west. He used a very different tactic than had his predecessors. He sought to pacify the West by giving it most of what it wanted and threatening to destroy anyone who wouldn't take yes for an answer. He had plenty of soldiers, plenty of money, and plenty of support from Paris. He allowed the locals to worship as they pleased. He did not worry about prosecuting priests who refused to support the revolution, and he did not enforce conscription. He proposed peace on these terms, even giving bounties to those who would turn in their weapons. He combined this peace offensive with a ruthless battle against armed foes. It worked well. By late April 1795, he was able to negotiate a treaty with the leaders of the rebellion in the Vendée and in Brittany, ending most hostilities. His soldiers, known as blues, were well supplied and strictly kept from harassing the locals. Peace was the result. The peace, however, was a sham, as the rebel leaders and their armed forces did not disband, and in fact looked to Britain for aid, hoping to use the time of peace as a time to rebuild their armies so that the next uprising would succeed in overturning the Republic. The English were more than happy to help. They had heard, as late as September of 1794, that there were 30,000 men willing to fight in Brittany alone, but that they badly needed arms and naval support if they were to open up a new front in western France. The British, seeing that Austria, Prussia, and Spain were all beginning to pull back from the war, decided to put their weight behind rebellion in the West. Louis XVIII and his younger brother Charles, called the Count of Artois, had divided responsibilities for taking back France by theater, and Artois was in charge of the rest. His goal was to have a local force of guerrillas in Brittany called Chouans, form up under a minor nobleman leading the guerrilla resistance in Brittany, Joseph Puiset, and have them meet an invasion force made up of French émigré nobles and conscripted prisoners of war at Quiberon, on the south side of the Brittany Peninsula. There, the two forces would combine and move to the interior, hoping to start a massive rebellion, culminating in a march on Paris to overthrow the National Convention and restore Louis XVIII. The British decided to support this plan. They began stockpiling arms on the Channel Islands. They agreed to ferry French royalist forces to Quiberon and give them naval cover. The British further promised that if this French invasion force did well, the British would land forces soon. On the 23rd of June, the invasion force left England, and by the 26th, a force of some 3,000 émigrés and 5,000 other troops arrived off the Quiberon Peninsula. The area around Quiberon was lightly guarded, and on the 27th and the 28th, around 8,000 men went ashore. They advanced across the island with minimal resistance and linked up with the Chouans on the 3rd of July. The invaders had optimistically brought supplies for 70,000 men and thought they would link up with a rebel army of about 30,000. Instead, only 10,000 rebels turned up. Still, things went well enough at first. On the 3rd of July, the only garrison on Quiberon surrendered without a fight. The royalists prepared to march out and stir up a massive uprising in Brittany. They moved very slowly, however. The two groups, a makeshift but real army led by the snootiest of French nobles, and a poorly trained guerrilla force led by men who'd been fighting in the field for a year or longer, got along very poorly, and they found it hard to coordinate their activities. On the 5th of July, General Hoche arrived at the base of the peninsula with a force of some 10,000 veteran regulars and thousands of less well-trained troops that he'd managed to cobble together. He easily defeated the Chouan forces guarding the approach to the island and had bottled up the main invasion force on Quiberon by the 7th of July. On the 10th and 11th of July, royalists attempted a breakout, but it failed. Over the next week, there were several more attempts at breakouts, all of which failed. On the 20th of July, Hoche ordered an attack on the fort, the strong point that the royalists held, and the Republican prisoners of war who'd been conscripted into the invasion force deserted and gave the force to Hoche's men by treachery. On the 21st of July, the royalists and Chouan forces surrendered, and the Chouan leadership, who could, fled. The invasion had been a terrible, embarrassing flop. General Hoche had destroyed the Chouan army and captured thousands of émigrés. Over the next few days, around 1,000 émigrés and leaders from the Chouan forces were shot without trial as rebels caught bearing arms. However, Hoche let the enlisted men he had captured go, and most of the Chouans taken prisoner were allowed to plead that they had been misled by their leadership and allowed to leave as well. Thus ended the last hope of Louis XVIII to stir up a great rebellion against the revolution, in ignominious failure. It would be almost 20 more years before he would set foot in France.